Lancaster. There we are. Right, I've done that bit. I'm too hot. Thermal comfort is one of my topics. So I'm at Lancaster University. How many people know where Lancaster is? How many people don't know where Lancaster is? If you take the British Isles and you spin it, we're in the middle, right? We're about an hour from Manchester, which most people have heard of, with a slightly dodgy football team. That will take you to an out-of-date web page, which I'm feeling guilty about not updating. And I've stolen a quote from an advisory board meeting without checking that it was okay. That's a bit dodgy, really. But it really struck me because we were talking about something I'm going to mention towards the end of this talk. And he said, we're metabolizing the planet for profit, right? So when we're thinking about introducing technology into the world, we need to be thinking about what kind of new systems are we bringing into being? What are the impacts of those? And are we leading to a growth in decarbonized things, in environmentally benign things, or are we not? So that's sort of what it's about. I'm going to say three things. I'm going to say that ICT, and I'm going to use AI as a case study, are globally significant and growing in their impacts. It's pretty hard to deny that AI is everywhere. Get off my Google search. That embedding these sort of technologies in what we do in all aspects of society, but I'm going to specifically use research as a case study in high performance computing in the middle of the talk, locks sort of certain growth in. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of responsible innovation, not when it gets to the hands of the end users, but way, way, way before that. Okay. I mean, you could stop there and leave if you wanted, or you could wait and see. So I'm going to say a little tiny bit about me. That's not me. And then I'm going to really talk about, I mean, this is not great news here. And then this is a bit from a research project we've done working with users of high performance computing primarily, but really trying to map out the system. Why, is growth for computing growing? Which it is, spoiler. And kind of how does that get enculturated? And then a few thoughts at the end. So what do? I kind of mainly look at the role of technology in trying to make things more or less sustainable. So I've done work on things like kids prospecting for renewable energy sources on the island of Tyree. Good whiskey, happy days. How students trying to reconfigure our relationship with heating, so we don't just totally rely on systems to provide us heating and cooling. We kind of work in harmony with sort of architectural systems. I've got some work going on in that area at the moment. Sort of sensing individual offices and looking at why it's always so overheated. I've done some work on food. This is one of my favorite studies ever, where we strapped a wildlife camera and saw what students were cooking and did carbon footprint estimation and energy management, and looked at how the repeated diet, the repeated things we do in everyday life constitute our carbon footprint, which is a kind of really important thing. But what I'm going to talk about today is ICT itself, the very infrastructures that we depend upon for our bread and butter in HCI and beyond. Right. So what you'll see a lot of is things like this. How AI for good is helping us integrate renewables into the grid. How digital twins are helping us make energy savings. But what we're not talking about there is whether the good that they do outweighs the impacts of doing the thing in the first place, right? And that's a very critical point that I'm very critical of. And my first bit of not very good news is this is temperature above average. This is parts per million of CO2. And these are the attempts to the world to get its shit together, metaphorically speaking, and get countries to agree to reduce their emissions. And as you can see, that curve is only going one way. Right? This is not having an effect. And that's because people are doing their best not to actually do anything, rather than show some bloody leadership, pardon my language. What I believe, if you think of, this is planetary boundaries kind of model, which comes from the Resilience Centre in Stockholm, that we should be in a safe operating space for humanity. I think it'd be hard to disagree. We don't want that, really. This basically looks at humanity's impacts on things like CO2, which we talk about a lot, and energy, but also sort of fresh water use, changing land use, acidification of the oceans. You can see various axes on which we're really not within the safe operating space. So if you're looking for real problems for your research to solve, there is a lot to go at here, right? Helping people enact better policy, be more aware of the impacts we're having as a species. Yeah, we should move on. But if we wanted to get our CO2 level sort of back to a level where the planet can sequester the carbon we're emitting, we'd have to do, this is 2024, we'd have to sort of do this. And actually, historically, even with things, I mean, if you went back and you looked at the Great Recession in the 1930s, you'd see it didn't do that, right? So that's something of a challenge and something of an urgent challenge. I hope you all agree. I didn't promise you good news, I just promised you a talk. So what's that got to do with computing, you might be asking yourself, which is something I ask myself a lot, frankly. So I think often when I see IT innovation, be it sustainable 6G I was looking at the other day, I think of what Priest in his 2016 Chi paper called the cornucopian paradigm. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet. Do as much large language models and as much blockchain and as much 6G as you like, without really thinking about the consequences. And we use this sort of language, this kind of deliberately divisive language like Ethernet and the cloud. It's light and it's airy and it's impact-free. Only that's not really the case, right? It uses energy and materials and all sorts of other things I'm going to talk about. So we have to stop that. So this is actually an old paper, this is 22, looking at training some different machine learning models. So I'm going to use AI as a bit of a case study. And I'll just draw your attention to this one. So this is well out of date now. This is a 6 billion parameter transformer model. And you'll see that it uses, emits as much CO2 to train that model as an American home. That's not just any old home. That's a really kind of high emitting home, right? Not the worst in the world, but definitely not good, right? Are we on 6 billion anymore? No, we're way beyond that, right? So we're burning a lot of energy. And actually, we're starting to see the big tech companies becoming energy producers and even implementing their own renewables. So how does technology have an impact anyway? Well, a lot of the focus you'll see will be around this one. So in the scopes 1 and 2 of our emissions, it's about how much energy we use, how efficient we are with that. And at scope 2, where does that energy come from? And that does matter. If you use the energy mix in the Nordics, it's quite a green energy mix. If you use the energy mix in Southeast Asia, it's quite coal intensive. The same computation will have a much bigger carbon footprint. But what we don't talk about enough, I think, are these things. How long does the system last? What's the infrastructure? How often does it have to be upgraded? Why do we produce such brittle systems that don't last any time at all, in fact? I mean, there's good business reasons why you might not want to do that. But the embodied energy that goes into producing the products usually dominates, right? This is part of the narrative around electric cars. The focus is always here and never how much energy it takes to build an electric car, which is very substantial. And then this one, there's a lot of guilt that we should be feeling, really, maybe not people in this room necessarily, about what happens at the end of life with IT. Only 20% gets recycled. The rest of it goes into some sort of fairly heinous human rights and environmental degradation. And there's all sorts of other impacts that we're probably more familiar with in terms of social impacts of technology, impacts on elections, various other things. So we did some work in 21, so this is out of date. It's quite hard to do this work because industry doesn't really want to tell you what they're doing. But we tried to estimate global greenhouse gas emissions of IT globally. It's made up of lots and lots of little pieces, data centers, phones, networks. So we did an assessment of the assessments and looked at the kind of underlying narrative. So if you're interested in that, check that out. I guess I can give you the slides. People can follow the links. But I mean, the punchline was in about that time, we were thinking it's equivalent to global air travel, right? So it's not insignificant. Probably harder to manage in a way because of how diluted it is. But anyway, ICT is significant, and I hope you agree that doing something about global climate change is worth doing, and it's worth doing now. I had a scary thing. You're not allowed to talk about climate change in Florida, apparently. Oh, the irony today as they run from the hurricane. Okay, let's not go there. Right, so how does computing become embedded in what we do? So this was a little project that was like there was this NERC-sponsored thing looking at the net zero pathway, really, for digital research infrastructures, and particularly things like high-performance computing. And they did a smart thing, actually. They got to the end of the project, realized they had some money left over, and got lots of little projects to do different things. And we took some of that and did a qualitative study with users, providers, and managers of high-performance computing, and funders as well, actually. And sort of mapped that out as a system. And we put actually, I should have put the report somewhere. It's on Zenodo. I can give you the link to the report if you're interested. What is DRI anyway? Well, it's in many contexts, it's kind of sensors and monitoring infrastructures. It's sort of digital assets and models, climate models, and how they get there, the sort of storage solutions for that. High performance computing at a international, national, group, institution, individual level, and all the kind of digital tools and platforms, which would include things like AI. Not really a single definition of it. Do you use digital research infrastructure? Good. And we're all on the same page so far. Right. So I'm just going to use some quotes from some of our participants. I'm just cherry picking, really. But generally, there was a feeling that the intensity of the compute we were demanding on was ramping up. And sort of that seems to be supported by the literature, which suggests that generally there is a reliance on computationally more expensive techniques, and that's pervading the disciplines, including arts and social sciences and sort of quantitative social science. And there was a lot of work in the project done, not in our project, but in the other projects, done on can we promote efficiency of compute? So that came out as a real narrative, you know, I'm using this compute, how efficiently am I using it? Can I make my jobs better to get more out of that system? Would that lower the footprint? We'll come back to that point in a minute. So this was some data we took from the Archer, which is a tier 1 supercomputer in Edinburgh. And this is job duration. And then what they did is an upgrade about here, right? And the big change that happened here was a lot more processing elements, but every process element had more cores on it as well. So the capability did a real jump. Do we notice anything particular about the computational demand and the capacity? Yeah, it's kind of a rebound effect, isn't it? We create more capacity so we can do bigger jobs. So people did bigger jobs, right? And this is what we see. There's a feedback loop. As you create more capacity, and you create new uses, so people fill that gap. And this is a classic rebound effect because, again, if you make things more efficient, you can squeeze more work through rather than do less stuff. Right? I'm not in any way flagging off high performance computing and saying that it doesn't have any value, and neither am I saying the same for AI, but we'll come back to that. Right, so you saw things like this. You know, if only half the cores are doing something, we could power off half the cores. But then, you know, if I only do 10%, then I can't power off those cores. So there was a sort of couple of narratives coming out here about efficiency. Could I better understand the hardware I've got to get more out of it? Could I do smarter things with what I'm powering on and off? And the answer is almost certainly yes. And as each generation of hardware has more sort of custom support, like vector processing, GPUs, whatever, so you can rewrite the tools people are using to get more out of that hardware. That is undeniably true, and that might even use less energy. But then this was just a snapshot of the use of Archer 2. I mean, there's a bit of maintenance period in here and some rebooting of some of the nodes. But essentially, the thing is flat out. This is not true of general cloud data centers, which are more interaction driven, but high performance computers are batch systems. They suck in workloads, they compute them, they spit out the results. And you know, any efficiency gain you get is more than offset by the push for more computation, is my thesis. Okay, not a very nice figure. Yeah. But what we also saw was something about what we called cultural waste, how academic practice leads to maybe redundant computation. So, I mean, it's a bit judgy, right? But an increasing science with little scientific value. It's so easy for someone to come along, download that code, take my data set, take their data set, take some other, I'm going to train this, I'm a researcher, right? So they're just sort of, I called it in a recent paper, I hope it's not one you're reviewing, performative publishing or something, you know, this kind of, I need to publish to survive as an academic, so I'm going to publish, and I'm going to jam this thing with this other thing and get a paper out. Probably get ChatGPT to write it. And also, you've kind of got this feedback loop that as a community, now you can do more computation, you can expect your papers to include more validation. This is, actually, there's a board meeting for the INWORK journal that I'm missing right now, where I mean, the papers are getting longer and longer because people are doing more and more validation steps and ablation testing of their AI models. And so the reviewers keep pushing for more, you know, and the clusters get bigger as the big industry players create bigger capacities. And the whole thing is feeding this growing expectation that you have to do more and more and more to validate your results. And setting that culture, I'm going to argue later, is something we can help adjust. But there's a bigger systemic thing. As the culture changes and the papers change to embed those computational tools, so you get things like this. Students read papers, right? That's part of the work. So they investigate the field. And the majority of those papers are results from big models. And when I say big models, that's models that require a lot of computational power. So I don't know about you, we've just refurbished a lab and every machine has a GPU card in it. Because you can't teach computer science without teaching some AI now. And then you need the capacity to feed that machine, right? And the kind of research topics people are picking, half the stuff I picked from my subcommittee at CHI, well, I don't know if I picked it, half the papers were AI papers in HCI. Anyway, I'm really taking a pop at AI, aren't I? Maybe I should apologize. I probably should have asked who's working on AI. Don't tell me. And then you see obvious things, like all ethnographic things, you see quite obvious things. That it takes skill and time to really tune your software to get the best out of the hardware and do a better job. But it's actually very, you know, you're pressured, you've got deadlines, you just need to get the results fast. So do more redundant compute to get the results. And I mean, there's also this sort of bigger cycle of publishing and building your CV and getting outputs from your project and other things, which is pushing people to generate computation. Then there's waste of a different kind, which is really, if we think about the hardware itself, how does that come into being, and does that ever get wasted? And there we see things like, as soon as the server goes out of warranty, you have to have a new one, because you don't want to take the institutional risk of having unpatched servers or unsupported servers. So then that hardware gets retired prematurely. And what we did see, I think I'll mention this later, is people getting to year end and finding they've got budget to spend and knowing that ICT supply chains are generally fast and buying stuff. There were definitely barriers to sharing resources. So instead of using one, you know, the national supercomputer, people were using their own. Partly that's the not invented here syndrome. Partly that's cultural. But it's also, I think there were constraints over things like fears over GDPR, security of data, especially health data, things that you could do on other people's facilities, but people would not take the risk to do. And then we're starting to see, they were talking really about the university context in Participant 5 case, policies around travel and more sustainable travel, ground travel, that kind of thing, but nothing dealing with ICT and ICT procurement other than, you know, the usual sort of procurement mechanisms. How long am I going on for? Yeah, okay. That's all right. It's definitely going to be less than an hour. That's the good news. So you get this entirely unquestioned practice, which until recently I probably didn't question either, right? I have 2 new postdocs. They'll each need a workstation with GPUs and probably a couple of NVIDIA. I mean, that's already out of date probably, is it? Yeah, so you can get some, I don't know, H100s or more. I don't know, doesn't matter. So we're buying the infrastructure. We're even taking a step further back costing in what we're going to buy at the point we apply for the funding and not really considering that. And I've already said that. Okay, so that's the middle bit, right? We saw a real enculturation of sort of expectations around compute, barriers to sharing and efficiency, but generally not enough in terms of that institutional cultural piece about how sustainable is the work you're doing, and how do you sort of limit that, degrow the footprint of that. So let's sort of pop out to the wider kind of system a bit. So I think I mentioned this earlier. There's a lot of focus on data centers and cloud computing around how efficient the cooling to the compute is and what that efficiency ratio is. And it does, what this basically says is if you do your computing somewhere else, you can affect the carbon intensity of the computation you're doing. So that is a thing. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors about whether people are really using green energy or whether they're really offsetting their carbon. So I'll just warn you about that one. But that might make, so geography does matter and the energy mix does matter, which is probably a new consideration for most. But let's look at AI, because I think this is a particular kind of, what's the name of it? Who is it who did the thing? Calls it the hype curve, right? Definitely not saying there's no value to AI, but also it is getting written into infrastructures very, very quickly, right? Every search I do on Google now inferences off an LLM, and I didn't ask for that. So you'll see things like this. Training a single AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetimes. This was 2019, so we've come a long way since then. And the paper sort of roughly linked to this was saying at that time, it was about 300 metric tons of carbon to train a model. And I think that would sort of be, you can amortize that cost over the uses of that model, right? So if you keep it around a long time and use it a lot, you're reducing the per instance cost of inferencing off that model. But the internet keeps changing, so you have to keep retraining models. There are fears over AI sovereignty, so everyone is training their own models. The EU are trying to do their own models. Every company is competing to have the biggest model and the most effective models. So that's not really what happens, right? It just keeps growing. And this was an example from, I think, Meta research. This was sort of 2019, 2021 data, looking at language translation. So this was French to English, I think. And the observation they made was this, that the AI growth is exceeding the efficiency gain through Moore's law, which I thought was a bit of a belter, really. So we're used to the processing capability having that kind of doubling time every 18 months or whatever. But what they saw was a 20 times model growth in 2 years and 1,000 time parameter growth for only a teeny tiny improvement in the classification accuracy, right? So it's absolutely vast. And then at the same time, kind of over a 6-year period, OpenAI, their model increased in scale 300,000 times, which is quite a lot. Yeah, I should really try and put some cheerful, I should put some pictures of cats in. That would cheer people up. Right. So I thought this was there is a factor here where the model growth becomes important for the hardware because it doesn't fit on the GPU memory anymore. So you need to upgrade your hardware because your model's growing. And if your model's growing faster than your hardware is growing, you need to change your hardware more often than its useful life. So you're starting to see these sort of hyperscaler data centers. And I think some of these, the newer GPUs are sort of in the 700 to 1400 watts of heat range. So you're having to do a lot of cooling. And the other news I heard the other day was some of the data centers are getting into emerging markets where and doing a lot of evaporative cooling. So they're sort of using water resources in places in the world where there's really, you're taking that water away from someone else. You're taking it away from other communities. And they've got a lot of spending power. So if we turn to sort of data centers, and I think AI is a driver of data center growth, but there are many other drivers of data center growth. We can kind of, these are countries down the y-axis here. And you see Italy's there at about 300 terawatts, but the global data centers are exceeding national data center demand now. I mean, quite hard to get this data. This data is probably a little bit out of date. There's a lot of data centers, and they're using a lot of energy, and that's probably twinned to these very demanding applications. And I think the question is, where's it going, right? Is if you take the most optimistic case, some projections done in 21, we're suggesting maybe 7% of global energy demand. I forget what I think that's by 2030, right? But at the rate of growth we're currently seeing, we could be talking 20% of global electricity demand. I mean, that's, I don't know about you, I'd like some energy left over for some other things, like cooking, transport, heating. So what's going to check the growth of that, I think, is the interesting question. Oh yeah, okay, we've had enough of those. But what we're starting to see is these things are happening at such scale now, and putting so much investment into buying renewable capacity, so that they can kind of be greener, that you're starting to see it dominate the energy picture around the world in many countries. So in Ireland, about 53% of its renewable energy supply a couple of years ago was going to data centers. And I had a very grumpy colleague from UCD, former colleague from UCD, going, we're almost getting brownouts because of the data demand of the day, you know, the energy demand of the data centers, and the energy cost keeps going up, right? And I had a talk from someone in Sweden where they couldn't put a commercial scale bread bakery because they couldn't afford to compete with the data centers who were buying the energy from the grid, and the grid wasn't upgraded fast enough to compete. So you're starting to see starvation of industries and a reshaping of what can use the energy of the grid because of this sort of growing demand. So I think there is another question here, which is, if you've already planned to decarbonize your energy system, did you really expect it to grow so fast? And what does that do to your roadmap for decarbonizing your national energy? Not good things, probably. But I want to take it away from energy systems with more good news for you. I think there's a bigger question here, the push for growth, right? Push for digitized industry growth, probably good for employing our graduates. But this was a quote that I stole from Richard Spencer, who's is actually an accountancy training body who are looking at sustainable training, really, for accountancy, and how do you declare your sustainable outputs as a business. And he said, yeah, but we're just metabolizing the planet for profit. You know, we can't keep burning through the resources at this speed. And part of the reason for that is we are dependent as an industry on some fairly shady dealings and extractivist practices about where those rare earths come from all those processors and solar panels and the rest of it, and where the waste goes quite often in the global south to get kind of recycled, and who's doing that, right? So we have to slow down the speed this machine is going, because we are going to run out of these things, and there's, you know, a lot of questionable stuff going on over there. And the final point I want to make, I think, almost final point, is that we're competing for the same sort of rare earths to build the renewable energy infrastructure we need to harvest sustainable energy. So these two things are part of the same battle, really. So there's a materiality to digital systems, and it's becoming a very integral part of our energy systems and what we do as a society. And I think, generally speaking, there's very little awareness of that and precious little governance of that. So you might be thinking, well, that's all very nice, but what can I do? So I'm going to try and do that if I can. So I think if in the project we had, oh, okay, there is the link to the project output. What we see is this sort of interacting system of demand for ICT technologies like AI, and how, you know, we provide capacity for that, but as HCI researchers maybe, as we make that really easy to use, we can encourage an adoption of things that are very expensive, or we could encourage an adoption of things that are far less expensive or far more cognizant of their impacts. And we could try and encourage as a sort of academic practice, as teachers, as educators, as citizens, more sustainability literacy on the importance of longevity of systems, on their various impacts, and why, you know, underwriting things that don't scale well and embedding that in what we're doing is a really bad idea. So I like to use this example. I think this is Ponte Vecchio in Florence. I've never been. And I love this picture because it's a bridge, and someone said, oh, we've got a bridge. Let's build some houses on the bridge. And, you know, the infrastructure has enabled a new thing, right? And I think when we invent technologies, or we help invent technologies, or we train people who invent technologies, we are laying down new infrastructures for the future, right? So the point I want to make is those infrastructures need to be sustainable. So here's my take-home messages. It's going to be short, isn't it? Good. AI is clearly important, but just a poster child for how impacts are not considered early enough, or people are not accountable enough for the impacts. Can we justify the gains we get, or limit or cap the impacts on what we help co-create? And how can we exercise leadership in all the aspects of our roles and to ensure sustainable practice gets embedded and we don't create path dependencies on growth? And my out-of-date homepage again. I think that's it. I'm very happy to take questions if you have any.
Thank you for the talk. I'm sorry. Hi. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. It's super inspiring and really interesting topic. And I'm not saying that just because I'm trying to understand it as well. I have this issue when it comes to this topic is, what is our role as HCI researchers?
Mm-hmm.
Like, can we actually do something here? Or is it a problem that should be left to the people that understand, let's say, AI and its depths much better than we do? And I'm saying that with a lot of honest questioning, yeah, because I don't understand it.
Shall I do the cheap answer?
Whichever you prefer.
Okay, the cheap answer is we wrote about this in our Chi paper 2 years ago, where we talked about green policy informatics, and basically we were doing some work with policymakers, right? And they were under huge pressure to essentially, it's quite interesting actually, but I can't really, we didn't formally interview them, so I can't really talk about this in a way. They're under a lot of pressure to cost things, right? They've got a policy, you've got the counterfactual of doing the policy and not doing the policy. And the documents they use to try and cost any digital intervention, whatever, is horribly out of date, right? It doesn't do a good job of capturing the impacts on society and the environment. So there's some huge complexity, time pressure, no tools to support them. Really in doing that, and these are hugely hard, uncertain things where you're trying to predict future impacts and you're trying to weigh off complex trade-offs. And I mean, you could make a sweeping generalization about capitalism, but I'm not going to do that. I think there are lots of areas. Everything has to decarbonize. Everything has to dematerialize. There are lots of systems. There's lots of complexity. There's lots for HCI to do in working with communities to help them do that. That's the argument of the paper anyway. But I also happen to believe it. I think I don't think HCI has a specific ownership of the problem, but I think we all have the problem and we all need to be working towards the solution. So and I do think there's HCI in terms of that third wave situated tech. And how, I mean, even things like some colleagues of mine at KTH were doing physicalization of academic flying practice and helping people come to terms with who gets to fly and is it just, it's always old gits like me. And it's not specifically me because I won't fly, but you know what I mean. There's lots that we can be doing in HCI, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, really interesting. I have a comment and a few questions. One easier, one more difficult. The easy question is, in the middle part of the talk, you refer to interviews. I was curious about how representative do you think, and you may just have an intuition about that, because the quotes you show seem to suggest that people are fairly aware of the situation? Were these participants self-selected? Did you like, was it snowball recruiting and all of that? And maybe I ask one at a time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a small sample study, right? You've got 25 participants across 4 groups. They're in some ways they're expert participants. So things like the providers, the infrastructure and stuff, they've got decades of experience. They really know what they're talking about. I think the issues from listening to the rest of the other projects come back are not out of line. I suppose in terms of HCI challenges, there are projects trying to do things like make people more aware of the impacts of running particular jobs on supercomputers and sort of how many trees is that or whatever. But the more interesting aspects were how people were kind of locked into inherited practice. You know, you join a group, someone teaches you what to do, you emulate what they're doing. The kind of repeated, you know, we've all costed in a grant maybe and thrown in some travel, and you know, we're in a hurry, there's a deadline, right? We're not the processes are not set to help you do a good job of that within institutions. So I think the more interesting, I think, I mean, obviously I cherry picked, right? There was hours and hours and hours of quotes I could have gone for, and this suits my narrative. But I do think, I thought quite a lot of the people, I mean, partly because some of the people were, we only had a really short project duration, so it was opportunity plus snowball sampling, to answer your question. Some of those were sort of environmental science, sort of climate modeling. So maybe there's a bit of bias there in the sense they're already pretty aware of the climate crisis, but or working with people who are. But I think it's hard to empower the individual at the point of use when it's more of a systemic problem. So you know, they still need to publish or they lose their job, kind of thing. So they still need to do the. Do you see what I mean? There's
Absolutely
sort of bigger picture there. Yeah.
That
So that was the easy one, was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Good.
interesting because then my next point latches on like links to that. So I really like the point, that's a comment that you made when you had your graph, which was the output of the project. I think what you said on that was more positive than the graph, because the graph seems to only have pluses.
This one? Or
yeah, exactly this one. Like you have one minus and everything else is a plus, which I think plus in this context means making things worse.
Yeah, so this is a causal loop diagram. It's more of an influence diagram than any kind of cause and effect, right? It's just a systems thinking mapping tool.
Yeah.
It doesn't, and actually, if you go here, these are interactive. You can kind of click on nodes and watch what interacts with what. And they're probably not finished, right? There will be pluses and minuses, and you know, ease of use accelerates demand and, you know, encourages uptake. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't particularly, we did a lot of these and I wasn't particularly choosy. I wouldn't like to say there are no things retarding. I mean, I would say, I mean, policy and setting policy and trying to think about what gets accounted for and what KPIs, you know, that could be a very powerful lever. Just because there are more pluses doesn't mean this isn't powerful, because there's no relativity here.
Yeah. But I think that this is really interesting. And then what you said on this graph, something I find really useful, which is that as HCI researchers and designers, one thing that we can do is to think about promoting the use of lower computation methods. And I think that we see a lot of that right now, right? Because there's like a ton of stuff, ChatGPT, which sometimes you wonder, like, do you really need ChatGPT for that or not? And I think with some of my students, we've been playing with chatbots. Like, there's a lot that you can do with rule-based chatbots, and do you really need to like re-implement those using ChatGPT or not? So I think that is really a valuable, concrete, tangible message in terms of like, as HCI researchers, think about lower computation kind of approaches. The more difficult question is building on that. So obviously a lot of this is driven by marketing and sort of market in general, right? As you mentioned, capitalism. There is a lot of it that is like, okay, the hype of ChatGPT, and within even the academic community, I think those of us involved in reviewing or meta-reviewing papers are seeing a huge lot that comes from there, because it's cool and everyone wants to sort of claim a bite of that. Did you look at the bigger scheme, and your title is we're metabolizing the planet for profit. I mean, what comes to mind is, I think, something you and I discussed a long time ago, the story of staff and planned obsolescence, and how like there is an entire science about how do we get people to chuck away things faster so that they buy more. Did you look at all into that level? Because it seems to me that you are hinting at that from this talk, but not really.
I mean, that's not a hard question, because the answer is no. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, some of the things around obsolescence came out, you know, upgrade cycles, national calls for funding, which meant the opportunity was there. So then we can leverage the money to get the next supercomputer, that kind of thing. I think we didn't specifically look at longevity of the software. I mean, it was more the opposite, that there are benchmarks that get established, and you need to use a toolkit the community accepts to get your work published, or you know, if you mess with the benchmark, then your results aren't comparative anymore. So there was a role. They talked a lot about how that tacit knowledge about how you do what you do as a researcher, where that comes from, how can you make the really good expertise perpetuate. And they talked about the role of research software engineers and things like that as people who are helping scaffold that, which I think is interesting, because there is a whole cycle to how research happens, and a loss of knowledge when people go into the next jobs and this kind of stuff. But yeah, I don't think we really, I mean, it was a small project and we were scratching the surface, I think. We've got a new one, I think I was saying, wasn't I, to Enrico, got a project starting in January for the next 3 years, which is sort of working with environmental scientists who are using the cloud and climate models and high performance computing, which is going to do a lot more. So, but I suppose, you know, just to pick up your point, as HCI researchers, we're pretty well equipped with methods for probing systems and system dynamics and these interacting factors. I think we're actually quite useful. I'm coming back to your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's right.
Hi there, thanks. That was very sobering and interesting.
Sorry.
Do you know at the moment, are there any tools that are being used by people to kind of track their kind of computational usage? If they're using AI tools, even if it's just to kind of review the current.
Yeah, I could probably point you at some papers and people who are doing it. The specific, so there's greenalgorithms.org, which is Loic. I don't know if I've got his, he was in here somewhere, wasn't he? Let me see if I can find his name. It's not that one, is it? So yeah, I mean, so he's just landed a big new grant to extend that work, actually. I think it's a Wellcome Trust one. So that's just starting. So the green algorithm stuff is going to keep getting developed, and they're going to keep expanding it. I don't know. I can't quite find it at the moment. There is carbontracker.eu, I think. So there's a few things that are trying to take computational workloads and turn them in, you know, communicate that in various ways, try and make that a bit more accessible. I think in the general case, probably not, although even the Mac has some stuff like measuring the energy intensity of processes. I've actually got a new module starting in January, which I haven't written yet, and I'm going to get students doing some stuff like that. So I'll have more to say on the matter by Christmas, or I'm in trouble. Yeah, but I basically want to make the materials for that course open anyway, so I'll be able to pass that on.
Hi, yeah, thanks. That was thought-provoking, certainly. So yeah, I guess a related point. So Kate Crawford makes the point that a lot of this is sort of hidden by design, and some of it is hidden because we've sort of overlooked these things. But even if we sort of take an approach where it's sort of like, well, let's find ways to either expose this or to force a company to sort of release that data, it's still really hard to make it understandable, partly because it's such an intangible thing. It's so hard to put it into scale. I wonder if you, this is again an HCI question, have thoughts about kind of making it something that's we can get a grasp on in some way.
Yeah, no, that's a really good challenge that I've not got close to be honest. So I do think there are things moving slowly. I mean, as you say, right, a lot of people don't want to talk about this, or they want to talk about it in a very sort of here's the sustainability highlight of my business, and we won't talk about the rest kind of a way. So I was doing some stuff for the DG Connect thing in the EU. They're trying to put some standards. There's an ITU 1480, I think, is about the methodology for sort of disclosing rebound effects and things like that. It's quite interesting. A lot of development around what do you measure, how do you measure it? Can we standardize that so we're all doing the same thing? And they will require data centers to disclose some metrics in the EU at least. And there's something in the US, I forget the name of it. So there are some movements, and some of these big kind of legislative frameworks will force some disclosure, and these are global businesses. So hopefully that once they start doing that will be beneficial. A lot of argument about what they disclose. So to the credit of the process, they had academics like myself waffling at them, and the IoT guy actually was very switched on. He knew the industry lobby was very, oh, well, we'll disclose this and this. No. You know, he was aware of the greenwashing and what was going on. So it was quite refreshing. So this was only about a month or so ago, and I thought there was some good thinking going on. That doesn't really address the how do you make it relevant to people. And I don't think some number of trees is a helpful metric, or but it's the sort of, you've got sort of numeric literacy and then the sort of intangibility of carbon. And there's lots of kind of artists and various people trying to are doing really interesting things with communicating what that is. But I don't have good answers. It's great HCI challenge though.
So Adrian, so you talk about working with the HPC community. And if you need to convince them, especially politicians, because here one way might be taxation of some sort or some type of regulation. You need then to get these people elected, and it's very hard, in my opinion, to explain to people that do not understand computing well how this works, because we will have very soon like assistants on the phones that are very powerful and will be served elsewhere. And then people will say, okay, I will just connect my phone overnight, it will load with not a lot of energy because it's just a phone, okay? And they will not see what is happening in the cloud farm. So I think I don't know if one way for convincing people will be really to try to embed in school curriculum like more computing. But it's not because we are in a computer science department, but because people might not understand what's going on well. Say the majority of people, because certain things are easy to understand. Like if you know a steel factory, you get the idea of the energy that is consumed there. But a cloud farm somewhere elsewhere in the world potentially is much more difficult. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really nice one. I mean, I obviously I'd like to see more computing everywhere, but in a sense, the best way to teach sustainability, it seems, is by really embedding it in other things. So, you know, I would, from my massive position of ignorance of what's being taught in schools at the moment, I don't know that the curriculum has really moved with the times, and I would say there is an opportunity, especially with the new Minister for Education, maybe to get in and say, well, you know, technology is displacing populations in Scandinavia, right? And you're cutting down trees to build wind farms, not for the local community, but for the data center, for the global community, and you've got to trade off those two things. It sounds like a good topic for, you know, PPR, for geography. This is just one of many infrastructures. I saw a nice talk at ICT4S this year about working with historians to communicate climate change, and how industrialization happened and how technology generations have come through. And that's more of a sociological kind of cut at it, but I think we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't silo it. I don't think we should silo it in computer science, although we should certainly update the computer science curriculum, especially given the sort of broad range, the move fast and break things, continuous beta culture of Silicon Valley encourages you to put technologies out on a globally significant scale and disrupt things in not always a particularly principled way. And I think we're still learning as a society how to get to grips with that kind of thing. And so that sort of, set of values you want to enshrine, but should be taught at school, but it's not like we should wait for we haven't got time to wait for a generation to come through and fix it. And all the evidence suggests that you enculturate people in the way things are currently done. So by the time they grow up, they're no better than the generations that come before them. So I think it's a broadband change about responsible innovation, actually.
Cheers. Thank you very much for the talk. It's fascinating. So I don't come from a HCI background, you had a computing background. I found this on a Green Champions webpage at UCL
cool.
and just wandered in.
Thank you for coming.
But I wonder if coming from perhaps a bit more of a practical standpoint, obviously departments have their own financial budgets, they have to, meet certain criteria. Maybe from a university management perspective, we need to start realistically looking at energy budgets on a departmental level and say, okay, well, we can see that this department is producing a lot of energy per, member of staff, member of PhD students. So that might be something that we kind of realistically need to consider if we want to say that we are sustainable researchers. And another thing I wanted to this is more of just an observation and something that you mentioned about sort of procurement practices. Procurement practices at a university are woefully, unprepared for any metric of sustainability whatsoever, even from the perspective of buying tech secondhand. I mean, in my personal life, I tell my friends, my family that there is absolutely no reason you should buy any tech new. There's just no reason, but you cannot do that at a university level. And even more, once you want to get rid of your stuff or even your lab equipment, things that aren't really computing related at all, there's no real mechanism to actually share that equipment. Someone down the street might have a great use for something that you have nothing to do with anymore, or is just sitting in a cupboard. So yeah, those are a few comments.
Yeah, no, great comments. I mean, I used to be a head department, right? I tried to get our old lab machines into local schools, and it's tremendously hard. The fears over licensed software, GDPR, student data going out into the world. If there's a fire because the power supply blows up, who's liable? There's all these interacting frameworks about risk and insurance and licensing, and it's a real knot to untangle. And I actually think, I don't know about UCL, but Lancaster is particularly poor at kind of moving stuff into a pool that people can use. I mean, in some of the lab-based subjects are much better at that than computer science. Kind of wet lab stuff, you get to reuse the fume cupboards and things like that. But not very good at sharing, downstreaming and secondhand purchasing. And I think there's some very naive, it needs to be looked at as a system, and then we need to pick those things off and address them, I think. I think the accountability one is very interesting. It's very hard. So in my other hat, I'm doing a lot of work on the university energy data and how we make sense of it. And it's very hard to get the data you need to work out just, who owns this room, who's in this room, how much energy gets apportioned to the people in this room. Organizations don't record that kind of metadata about what connects to what, even what's connected to what circuit in the building, as it actually gets pretty knotty pretty quickly. I could talk about that. I could just, but I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. Yeah, good points.
Well, researchers, I'm sure we can figure something out.
Yeah, researchers can do, the next time you're looking for finding project topics, and do stuff with procurement on why it's not more sustainable. And they're starting to do dashboards, but they're awful.
Yeah, I had some discussion with Sustainable UCL about creating a platform because part of our sort of LEAF framework to have some, what I fear might become one awful dashboard that will be something that nobody uses, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, if you can try, I mean, I'm a great fan of, what is it, inflection points? Is it inflection points? Donella Meadows, is it inflection points or leverage points? I can't remember which. But basically, you know, doing things at the policy level are much more impactful than doing things at the sort of individual level. And so I think if you can get in and find a good intervention point and do projects that sort of change a practice, I think that would be worth doing.
Thank you.
Right.
Do you have any questions in mind?
So many questions.
Ah, really?
Ah.
Okay, I'll just ask a few.
Oh yeah, I forgot there were people online. Sorry.
Okay, they all thank you for the great talk. Tim Little asks, do you think substantial amounts of energy is wasted due to the bad, inefficient code in both academic and commercial applications?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, yes. But so I think most of us now code on top of an iceberg of layered toolkits and whatever, right? So I'm very old, and I had a computer with 7K of RAM, and you'd be amazed what I could do in 7K of RAM, right? But now I have a computer with 36, don't ask me why it's 36 gigabytes of RAM, and it's not, I mean, it is beautiful and fast, and it does all sorts of things I couldn't do before, but you know, there were layers and layers of toolkits and virtual machines and stuff, right? So I think it's not so much about poor software engineering, and I think green software engineering hasn't even made it to the curriculum yet. So I think there is a lot of poor practice, but actually the whole practice of the kind of layering and constantly expanding toolkits, which may be embedding all sorts of cloud calls and machine learning and expensive blockchain and who knows what, right? I mean, computer science does abstraction layers, right? That's how we solve problems, is by building on these things. But we also have to, you know, have some view under the hood of whether those are expensive things or not. So yeah, so I think, yes, I think tremendous amounts of energy are wasted. I also kind of like this idea, which is the hard thing of sufficiency, right? Doing, you know, when have you done enough? And then if you're going to have a threshold and you're going to bring it down to kind of decarbonize over time or something, what do you not do? And that raises just tremendously hard questions for society about cryptocurrencies and gambling and pornography and AI, right? You know, what do you get to do and what do you not get to do? And do you keep the climate modeling? Probably. Do you need climate modeling? Every time you add more capacity, you can just ramp up the accuracy coefficients and just drive it finer and finer, right? So there probably is even a limit to how much climate modeling you need, but I'm just not sure we're asking those questions. That's a good question.
Shall I continue with the questions?
If you like.
Do we have time?
Do you have time?
I mean, we are at 5, so we will let the room
go if they want to.
Run away if they need to. And then maybe better in time we can continue briefly with the online questions. So maybe if Adrian prefers, we can send them to you. We can.
I'd probably prefer to hang around for 10 minutes and just answer a couple more questions.
We take a break. So if anyone wants to touch up, because normally we do that at the hour because people may have been.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for coming. Nice to see so many people. I appreciate that.
I'll just continue.
Yeah,
Okay.
fine.
You've talked a bit about this, but Sella the chemist, asks, is it possible to build longevity into computer equipment so that you have more time to amortize scope 3?
Yeah, so the question is, I suppose about maybe we just wait a second. Yeah, no, it's fine. Okay, I'm going to try and answer a couple more online questions. So I don't know if you could just knock the door shut. Yeah, so that was a question about, can you make the hardware itself last longer, really? So I think there's a couple of things there. I think one, we're very locked into a bit of an arms race to do more and more stuff on a chip using the methods we know and understand, which are very reliant on rare materials. So there's a sort of question about what a genuinely sustainable computer would be, and can you biological computers or computers. I don't know if they can hear me at all.